Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 644 through 646, which will cover manga chapters 714 through 716. I don't know why I took such a long pause. The Sunny is under attack while Luffy is in the heat of battle in the Corrida Colosseum Block C. Alright, so synopsis. As one of Doflamingo's officers infiltrates and attacks the Sunny, Luffy is now starting his C block round of the Corrida Colosseum Tournament. Luffy will have to defeat a large assortment of formidable fighters with quirky abilities while also trying to maintain his disguise. Alright, so again, like most of the Dressrosa episodes, there are quite a few differences. Not quite as much as the last episode, but there are definitely a lot. So, starting off, at the beginning of episode 644, there's an extended scene of Jola slowly transforming the Sunny into her, using her Ato Ato no Mi art powers. And in the anime, when Jola emerges from the dormitory cabin, the Straw Hats are still on the deck and unchanged, and we see her transforming them. However, in the manga, when she emerges, they're already transformed and in the water on the waiver, and the sharks submerge. One very slight change they made is when Ushi rams Hiruden's ankle in the manga, he actually stabs it with one of his horns, while in the anime, he just kind of rams it and bumps into it. Mostly done probably for censorship reasons to dumb down the violence a little bit. Another change is there's a random filler scene of Zoro and Wika running around lost in Dressrosa. This scene is not in the manga at all. And in the manga, after Ideo knocks Hiruden's body out of the arena into the stands, the fighting just continues with more introductions of other fighters. Also, after this scene, we get a non-canon scene of Law's fight with Doflamingo and Fujitora on Greenbit, which never occurs either. There's also an extra fight sequence between Ideo and Luffy, but this is also filler for the anime, as this doesn't happen in the manga, and in fact, after Ideo is introduced, Luffy kind of disappears for a little bit, and the other fighters are introduced here, like Sai and Boo and like the Funk Brothers and all that stuff, so yeah, this is definitely a little bit more filler. There's another added filler scene of Nami and Momo running from Jola, while Brook and Chopper are told to fight back. In the manga, it never cuts away from the C-block fighting after Sai beats the Funk Brothers. And yeah, this is something I really hate about the anime, where in the manga, all of the Corrida Colosseum stuff, the fighting is just one continuous sequence, whereas in the anime, it keeps cutting away for no reason. And it just elongates things unnecessarily, and it's really annoying to have to like keep breaking up these like fighting sequences. Similarly, the moment right after this scene where we see Jean the Bandit create this sort of big ball of weapons like Kid, this scene is also not in the manga, although it does kind of go on to explain how he's able to keep throwing so many weapons at Luffy, and then eventually going on to like stabbing Jinzhao in the belly. But also in the anime, it goes out of its way to show Jean like hitting other fighters, when in the manga it's basically portrayed as him just constantly throwing at Luffy and only Luffy. And he just happens to hit other people. Those are the major differences that I kind of wanted to mention here. So let's get into the episodes. The episode starts off with the follow-up to the cliffhanger on the Sunny, where the dormitory was transformed into some weird painting style. And just as the warnings from both Wika and Violet indicated that Doflamingo had sent one of his officers to attack the Sunny, and here we are properly introduced to Jola, who serves in the Treble Army and possesses the wild devil fruit, the Ato Ato no Mi, or the Art fruit. And Ato Ato is kind of I don't know, it's kind of a stretch, because basically in Japanese, if you were to say art, it would be ato. So you'd have that sort of elongation in between a and to. But because of the way the naming convention works in devil fruits, you can't really have a third syllable in there. So it's just shortened to ato ato. And that's how you get art fruit. And there's a lot with this character and this devil fruit. Jola herself, as has been pointed out by many, seems to resemble the comedian persona of Dame Edna Everage, created by Barry Humphries. Now, I'm not too aware of Dame Edna as much as she was a bit before my generation, but she was fairly famous, particularly in the UK as a comedian and a TV chat host. And I've heard of Dame Edna. She's often referenced in a lot of different things, but I've never actually seen much of her. But upon looking her up, yeah, Jola certainly looks a lot like her, right down to the the crazy glasses and the way they both talk. Her powers, the art fruit, seems to draw inspiration from several different art styles, from great artists and painters like Salvador Dali, Edward Munch, and Pablo Picasso. More specifically, Brooke looks to have been transformed into something similar to the Scream painting by Edward Munch, and Nami and Momonosuke are very much in the style of Picasso, with Momo actually being turned into a peach, referencing his name Momo, which is peach in Japanese. And finally, Chopper is turned into sort of this cubist style artwork, also pioneered by Pablo Picasso. The Sunny also gets a Picasso-fied transformation as well. Now, Jola's power kind of reminds me a little bit of like Khalifa's Awawa fruit, the bubble fruit, in the sense that they both can physically alter their enemies' bodies to make it impossible or very difficult for them to fight back. And back at the Colosseum, there's a brief scene with Ricky as he's being offered treatment for his injuries from the last round, but keeps refusing despite his continued bleeding. And he's approached by Rebecca, who says that he should get treatment. And we see flashes that he knew Rebecca as a child and was very close to her at some point. And at this point, I remember being convinced that this was Kuros, but it also didn't quite make sense why she didn't seem to remember who Kuros was at all. If she knew about this, about these memories, like, it's very confusing. There's this like underlying mystery surrounding Kuros and Rebecca, and now this Ricky guy. Bellamy, in another part of the Colosseum, is given the task of killing Luffy from Diamante by Doflamingo. Doflamingo at this point is just cruelly playing with Bellamy, knowing just how much he wants to join the Donquixote family, but has no intention of ever giving him a seat at the table, and is just torturing him by sending him up against an opponent that he has no hope of defeating, but also doesn't even have any ill will towards anymore. I don't think at this point Doflamingo knows that Bellamy is starting to actually admire Luffy, but it just adds yet another layer to the tension with Bellamy's story here, about now that even though he kind of actually respects and admires Luffy, he's now given the task of basically trying to kill Luffy in order to achieve his dreams, which is something that probably causes a lot of dissonance in his mind. Now, getting back to the actual tournament, we actually get to see some canon parts of the fight as we see how a giant is performing in this tournament, where I feel like were it not for Luffy being in this block, Hiruden would be the favorite to win this. I mean, seriously, how do you beat an Elbaf warrior giant? Probably the most interesting thing that Hiruden states in retrospect is his declaration that he wants to acquire the Meramenomi to become the king of the giants, which at the time was of course noteworthy because it was intriguing to understand what that meant, as in, did he want to become the king of Elbaf, or was that more of a general statement like he wanted to rule over all giants? Because as we know from Saul, that Elbaf isn't the only land with giants, and there are other giant nations and clans out there that aren't necessarily tied to Elbaf. However, this statement takes on a whole new meaning the more we learn about Hiruden much later on. So keep this scene in the back of your mind for much later, because I kind of disregarded this line really when it first was published and aired, because I didn't really think much of it. But it turns out this is actually kind of an important one. Meanwhile, as was shown in the last set of episodes, Luffy has completely befriended Brutal Bull and named him Ushi. This name is a play on words, as cow or cattle in general in Japanese is Ushi, which also happens to be very similar to Lucy, or in Japanese, which is pronounced Lushi. So you just take out the R and you just get Ushi. So you get this like similar name for both of them. And I know in the manga translations they call him Musi, which works more in English, but then kind of loses that wordplay a little bit. But in any case, Ushi is actually really cute, and when he's all smiling with Luffy as they rampage around the battlefield, it's just really funny and cute. Eventually they do pick a fight with Hiruden, and they both get quite literally pounded into the ground, but of course Luffy is unharmed, but Ushi isn't so lucky. And when you mess with Luffy's friends, you get the horns, which gets him immediately going from having fun to serious mode, which has him going gear second and in an instant knocks Hiruden down with one jet pistol. This kind of gets glossed over a bit because you kind of take it for granted how strong Luffy is at this point, but he just took down a giant in one shot. Like, think about it for a second how much he struggled against Dory back on Little Garden. Granted, neither of them actually wanted to hurt each other, but still, Luffy definitely could not subdue Dory easily, but now he can just easily handle a giant, which is just another indication of how much Luffy's strength has grown. And I love how Luffy, even during all this, he is still so kind to his friends by taking the time to thank Ushi and carrying him to the sides of the arena so that he won't catch any stray attacks and be safe and get any, won't actually get hurt any further. And I also love that by this point, Gats, the announcer slash commentator, is completely showing his favoritism and isn't even bothering to hide it, while the other two ladies around him are telling him that he's supposed to be an impartial judge, which is kind of funny too. I guess, although, I wonder when Luffy eventually does the whole, Conquerors Haki clash with Chinjiao at the end of these sets of episodes, I would imagine that since that blast was strong enough to blast even Ideo and Sai off the platform, I'm assuming that Ushi was also somehow knocked over as well. So hopefully he's okay. From here, the other prominent fighters are given their proper introductions, like the Happo army members like Sai, Bu, and Chinjiao. Chinjiao is an interesting character because everything we've heard about him makes him quite the formidable challenger, as he's not only supposedly gone toe-to-toe with Garp, but also possesses Conquerors Haki and has a 500 million berry bounty, which is insane considering Luffy still only has a 400 million berry bounty at this point. With this revelation and Hyruden down, it is looking like Luffy will need to ultimately beat Chinjiao to get to advance from C Block. However, before that, we are introduced to a couple more fighters like John Ango, who kind of reminds me of Amingo from Marvel vs. Capcom 2, but his name is a reference to a real-life person from the 14th century of the same name who was a Norman privateer ship owner that provided ships to the King of France and I guess at the time, Francis I, and eventually went on to run an import-export business. None of this background has anything to do with the character, but that's how thorough I am in this podcast. I try and at least look up the different references. Probably the stupidest, but also the funniest part about this character is the fact that they make this big deal about how he goes around collecting all these melee weapons, but then immediately and unexpectedly turns around and declares himself a sniper and throws the weapons. What's even the point? Literally anything will work, but it kind of makes sense why he needs to continue to collect and steal weapons, because he's just going to go around throwing them all away at people, which I don't know why this was so... I remember reading this the first time and thinking to myself, what in the world? Because, you'd think that this guy would be collecting weapons to attack people with, as a swordsman or a melee fighter, but then just randomly just starts throwing them and calls himself a sniper. It's just so weird and so unexpected. The scene then shifts the attention to the bounty hunting Funk brothers, who I forgot to mention in a previous episode. They're based on the wrestling Funk brothers, Terry Funk and Dory Funk Jr., which, as you know, Oda is a huge fan of wrestling and has thrown in wrestling references here and there. Most notably, Spandam's masked look is based off of Mankind. And yeah, we'll go on to see that for some reason, Bobby was able to withstand a Haki-imbued axe strike from Boo without so much as even a reaction, showing just how strong of a body he possesses. But he seems to have an incredibly weak-willed personality. This, of course, is offset by his incredibly aggressive brother, Kelly. But what makes them so formidable is that Kelly's strange... He's just got a strange-ass devil fruit. And this is by far one of the most ridiculous and, frankly, kind of dumb devil fruits Oda has ever come up with. Kelly has the Jake no Mi, or the jacket fruit, with jake being the first part of jaquetto in Japanese. And this fruit allows the user to turn himself into a jacket and be put on by anyone, and thus allows the user to control that person that they're, covered on. Which is incredibly convenient that this fruit somehow found its way into the hands of the most perfect combination of people, where one brother is sort of this fiery hothead but has a very weak body, compared to his brother who's very subdued but possesses an immense strength and durability. And you combine them by having Bobby wear Kelly and become a formidable fighter. And even just saying this is just ridiculous. This devil fruit is so weird. The users for this is so niche. It seems like when the user turns himself into a jacket, he kind of just lays there defenseless. So there's like no scenario where you could like surprise someone and wrap yourself around them and take control of your enemy or something. Like they actually have to put you on, or someone else has to put you on them. Also, as a side note, the move name 2-in-1 coat, or in Japanese it's called ninin baori, is a term for a comedic bit in Japanese comedy where two comedians will stuff themselves into a large coat and perform a sort of sketch where one has control of the arms and the other the facial expressions to create like these comedy sketches. It's a pretty common thing that you see in a lot of different TV shows and comedy shows. And I get from a storytelling perspective why it's written that it's a surprise twist to build tension, but in practicality, why not just enter the battlefield with this ability already used? Like, they just come in with Bobby wearing Kelly. Like, it doesn't make sense for them to enter individually because they're so weak without each other. Despite this seemingly overwhelming advantage, having the 2-in-1 strength and an incredibly tough body, Boo's brother Sai steps in to avenge his fallen brother and knocks the Funk Brothers out with just one shot dropkick. And the reason for this is due to his use of their martial arts style, the Hashoken, which translated means 8 impact fists. And this fighting style is based on imbuing vibrations to their attacks, which can bypass many defenses along with Bobby's incredibly durable body. It's actually pretty interesting fighting style, almost like a natural but weaker way of fighting like Whitebeard with his Gura fruit. It is very interesting, and I wonder if this is maybe something that could be used to sort of bypass armament haki as well. Next, we finally get back to see what Luffy is up to as he's still trying to take back his helmet from Jean the Bandit. And this scene is kind of fun with some bit of nostalgia mixed in, as Jean's goal is to capture all the major prisoners that escaped from Impel Down when Luffy broke out 2 years ago. He mentions Buggy, Crocodile, Jinbei, Shiryu, and Ivankov. And I love while dodging this barrage of weaponry flying past him, Luffy just kind of reminisces and wonders how Jinbei and Ivankov are doing. Although in the manga, he only actually thinks about Ivankov because he kind of knows how Jinbei is doing since he just saw him like a couple weeks ago in in-universe time. So I'm not sure why the anime felt the need to include Jinbei other than for maybe like little children and people who don't watch One Piece as regularly or as in-depth as us crazy fans. And this is also the moment Luffy learns that there were other people from level 6 that escaped, but doesn't quite learn who. Of course, these are all the people that Blackbeard took with him, like Pizarro, Katarina, San Juan, and Vasco Shot. And also during this flurry of weapons, Jean was so preoccupied with hitting Luffy that he wasn't looking where he was actually throwing, and it turns out that several stray swords landed in Jinzhou's belly. And this scene is pretty funny. John's face at this sudden realization is so funny as he gets these like really pure anime eyes, like almost like shoujo manga level eyes, like these very detailed and soft looking eyes. What makes this scene so amazing though, especially in the anime, is how during this moment of instant regret, it quickly cuts to Luffy just walking right up to Jean and taking back his helmet saying, "Give it back." It just walks away very casually while Jinzhou is like launching himself at Jean to knock him out. And the comedic timing in the anime is just amazing. Like, I got a chuckle out of this scene in the manga for sure, but seeing it in the anime, the way that it just cuts straight to Luffy and then cuts away from him is so funny because it's so sudden. And then these episodes conclude with Jinzhou tracking down Luffy. Luffy realizing that despite him not having a personal grudge with Jinzhou is just going to keep coming after him and figuring he's going to have to defeat Jinzhou anyways at some point to progress in the tournament to win the Mera Mera no Mi. So he commits to getting a little serious and taking him on with Gear 2nd active. And they both clash in a massive explosion of Conquerors haki that knocks pretty much everyone else out of the ring or even leaving them unconscious, with only the two of them left standing for the C block round. And when you kind of take a step back, it's kind of nuts thinking a guy with this much strength is just kind of a side character in this arc. Usually someone like this would be a major player in an arc. A man that can somewhat rival Luffy in pure strength and a former rival of Garp is just sort of hanging out. Like, I remember thinking to myself, what role is this guy going to play for the rest of the arc once this tournament is over? You know, once the whole conflict with the Donquixote family actually begins. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see like a lot of these characters are pretty strong in terms of fighting ability. So it'll be interesting to see what roles they play later on. But one last thing I wanted to mention about this scene that I didn't feel like it warranted a specific mention in the differences section, but one thing I noticed was that in the manga, when they did this clash, they used their right arms to punch. In the anime, for some reason, it flips it and has them punching with their left arms, and their positions are also flipped relative to the camera as well. In the manga, Luffy is standing on the left while Chinjao is on the right, and it's reversed in the anime. And I wonder if this has to do with some sort of principles of like shot composition or shot flow, for TV and film as opposed to like Japanese manga. Like, it made more sense from a screenplay perspective to have Luffy on the right, maybe, but in order to make that work while still preserving the image the way Oda drew it, where Chinjao was facing the camera and Luffy's back is to us, they had to swap their arms too for that to make sense. It's kind of a weird change, and it really doesn't change anything, but I just found it really interesting how it was reversed in the anime. Anyways, yeah, it's now down to 2 people in the C block, but how is Luffy going to get past Don Chinjao? And how are the Straw Hats on the Sunny going to beat Jola? We'll have to wait till the next podcast to get into that. But if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast for updates when I post new episodes, or see some pictures of my manga collection. And I know I haven't really been posting, and I've been really bad about that. But yeah, anyways, I thank you for listening and supporting the podcast. And if you feel like supporting me extra, you can check out my Buy Me a Coffee profile found on the website, but of course not required whatsoever. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to the podcast. Just a tiny spoiler section here, but if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye. All right, so spoiler section. So I guess the one thing I kind of wanted to touch upon when it comes to the spoilers for these sets of episodes is surrounding Hyruden. Because like I mentioned in the non-spoiler section, there's a line in there about him wanting to become king of giants. And yeah, I mean, I think when I first read that, and even up until recently, and this is, I guess I should say that this is as of chapter 1147. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting, because I completely disregarded this line and I had completely forgotten about it until we got to the Elbaf arc. And it started to become very clear and apparent that this line and sort of Hyruden's story about him being the son of King Harold, but kind of an illegitimate son with another foreign-born giant. And so he kind of gets ostracized by Loki and all of that stuff. And so his sort of dream of wanting to become king of Elbaf and the giants, and I think from what it sounds like, and granted, not much of the story hasn't been revealed yet, because this portion of the plot in Elbaf kind of has taken a backseat to, everything with the gods, knights, and everything. But yeah, it's interesting to see once we get the flashback, probably with like Loki, Hyruden, and Harold, that will basically take up a lot of the middle chunk of Elbaf. We haven't actually seen that yet, but once we get there, I'm sure that we'll start to learn a little bit more about this dream and this goal and why he wants it and why he's been unable to attain it. And so, yeah, this one line, though, it's interesting how Oda had planted the seeds for Hyruden's character and his story, which will then go on to be explored more than, what is it? I think this came out in, 2013 or 2015? Somewhere in that area? So yeah, almost 10 years ago, and we're finally, actually, we still haven't really learned about it yet. It'll probably be another few months before we actually get to a point in the story where we actually get to see Hyruden and Loki's past and see how all of that develops and where that ends up going in the story too. Because, I mean, it sounds like the way that this story is going is that the Elbaf pirates are going to be a huge part in sort of the final war that will take place between the forces of good and the world government. And so, yeah, most likely Hyruden or Loki or both will end up being sort of the new leaders of Elbaf, kind of replacing Yarl and Yorl And as you know, well, now it's just Yarrow, but I mean, I have a feeling that Yarrow will either die or step down towards the end of Elbaf. But yeah, again, like I've always said, I'm not very good at theory crafting or anything like that. But it is interesting how this one line set all that up and then nothing came of it for like 10 years. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Anyways, that's all I really wanted to mention with this episode. But yeah, thanks for listening, and catch you later. See ya.